Have you ever seen something so beautiful, so inspiring, that as soon as you saw it, you knew you'd have to do something about it? Yeah, this cup was it for me. Welcome back to the channel, everybody. My name is Garmin. This, of course, is the Storycraft Society, and this week I am proving a point that inspiration can come from anywhere. When you're crafting things, sometimes you just see something, it catches your eye, whether that be a shape or a texture or a color or whatever it may be, and it makes you want to make something. So no joke, not lying, I literally walked by my craft table and saw one of these baking cups, and all of a sudden my mind started to spin together a story, and the rest is history. The main part of what I saw that was cool about this build was I thought of an idea where this particular building or hut, whatever it would end up being, was going to be built inside of a rock. Now, a friend of mine sent me this photo a while ago and it got my juices going, and I always thought that I was going to make something like this that was an inn or a larger building. But by the time I started thinking about this little baking cup building, I really felt like this was a cool direction to go. I felt like it had a lot of character, like it would be something unique for my table. I started the whole process by sketching out some ideas of what I saw in my head so that I just had a direction that I was going to be going. And then from there, it just all started to snowball and roll downhill. So, let's take a look. I started with some XPS to make the rock. Now, the important part here is that I needed it to be taller than the baking cup so that the baking cup could sit inside of it. Of course, that meant that I had to pull out a couple of scraps, stack them up, and then PVA glue them together. For this, I just used my Eileen's tacky glue and made sure to weigh those down so they got a nice solid bond. While that dried, dry time, I could get started on the other side. So the other side is just going to be a little square structure that's going to be some kind of an addition built onto this little structure. So I started that by pulling out another scrap of XPS foam and then using that to make a corner on the outside of the baking cup. Now, this was a little bit tricky because I had to cut it so that it matched the curvature of the cup, but once I got that done, I just hot glued it into place, and that started to work as my substructure. Now, the one thing that I knew that I was going to do is by the time I got to the end of the project, I was going to be using foam stripping on the actual baking cup itself. So what I needed to do was come up with a way to make this exterior side structure look visually different from the rest of the piece. One really easy way to do that is to just use a different crafting material. If you're going to be using foam on one section, use craft sticks on the other, and that's exactly what I did. So I pulled out my craft sticks and I started to go to town getting the sides all sanded up. I textured them so that they looked like wood from a distance, and then I began gluing them into place. Now, the one thing that I will say is that before starting this, I did carve my door out of the foam. That way it was easier for me to be able to get a wire brush in there to get the wood texture, as well as to get everything all notched out and to the right size. Then I took a page out of my own book from a couple of videos ago and I painted all of the crevices in black. That way it will save me so that I don't get a whole bunch of paint up close against my craft sticks trying to get down in and hide all of that green foam. This is a really awesome thing that I'm going to try to do on as many builds as I can because it just saves so much time and stress later. When it came to gluing the craft sticks on, I believe that past Garmin has something he wants to say about this. Goodness gracious. I do this, I think, every time I work with wood. I end up being really excited and liking the idea of working with wood until I do. And then it goes insanely slow. And the end result doesn't look any better than foam. I really hope that it does visually set something apart, because then at least I know that it was worth the effort. But there's that. Ready to move on to the next bit. Woo! So certainly it is needless to say I was happy to be done with that part. But with a day or so between me and the build now, I'm really happy with the way that it turned out. I just, was being a little bit of a baby in the moment. Moving on. So by the time I got all of my craft sticks done, it was time to go pull out my XPS and see if it was done drying. Good news was that it was dry, so I began to texture that up to look like a rock. That was easy. I just used a combination of my hot wire tools and an Alpha knife and made sure to cut it up so that it had a lot of interesting, different angular pieces so that it would take dry brushing well and would be rock looking on the table. The next thing that I did was I notched out the inside of the rock so it fit on top of my baking cup. This was a little challenging. It just took me notching and cutting and notching and cutting until finally I got a good shape. I did have to do a little bit of sanding in the end just to make it perfect, but then I took and pulled out my hot glue and jumped the gun and glued it on. So while I was all hyped up on being upset about how long the wood was taking to craft, very healthy crafting, by the way, I realized that I glued the rock onto the main structure when it would have been way easier to texture it with my tinfoil ball before that. That's why you don't craft frustrated. When you start to get frustrated, take a break, walk away from it, and you will end up making better decisions. But because I am not that smart, I've made a bad decision, and I will pay for it by having to do this the hard way. So let's get this knocked out. Let's go. One thing that did jump out to me in this stage was I realized how neat it would be to have a little stovepipe coming out of the rock, kind of implying that there's actually structure back in there, that maybe the family that had this little hut first started and it was just the rock with a sheer face on it that they kind of carved back into. Eventually they needed more space. They built out to where the baking cup was and then finally built out again to where the new construction of the little craft stick area is. I love this idea, so I wanted to put that stovepipe in there. Also, what better place for a stovepipe than to go up through rock, because you're not going to burn that part of your house down. Now for the pipe itself, I ended up using a paintbrush tip protector. These are the little plastic things that just slide onto the end of a pointed tip paintbrush. Then I decided that I was going to put a little cap on it. I started this by trying to make the little cap out of foam. I cut it down to an angular kind of triangle piece and then started to sand it down to try and get it smooth and make it look like a little stovepipe cap. This didn't actually work, and that's okay because about halfway through I realized I could probably take a piece of paper, roll it up and glue it, and then use that to make the cap, and that ended up working great. The one thing that sucked is I had to use PVA glue on that, so you know it, you love it. Dry time. Moving on to the next section, I needed to do the foam planks on the baking cup itself. So what I did was I cut a bunch of strips of those out and then began to get them ready to glue them into place. I wood textured them up using a plastic wire brush, and then in order to make sure that it fit, I had to actually slice these off so that it made like a very steep, like trapezoid shape. Now it might not look like much on camera, but this is an absolute lifesaver, because if you didn't do this, eventually the strips would end up falling off to the side because they would continually get steeper and steeper. This allows them to all stay straight up and down, and I was able to run them the whole way around the outside with hot glue. One thing I did notice in this step though is how little support the actual baking cup gave for that middle part. I thought once I got the rock and the exterior on, it was going to stiffen up a lot more, and it didn't. I'm not sure if it was actually a problem that needed to be solved, but it's something that I did just to be safe, and I'm glad that I did. I stacked a couple more baking cups up and hot glued them all together. That made a really rigid, firm structure to fit up underneath there. Whew, this was a lot of hand gestures that I was doing. And then I trimmed the bottom off so that it wouldn't stick out below the main baking cup structure on my building. Then with hot glue, I glued that up in, and it really solved the problem. Like I said, whether it was a problem or not, it did make sure that the outside of it now felt a lot more stiff. Now about this point, the cap for my stovepipe was dry, so I was able to get that ready to go. I started that by cutting it off from the rest of the paper and then used hot glue to glue it to my pipe and then glued that all down into the rock. And honestly, this turned out super cute. I really like this little touch of flavor, and it gives kind of a boring rock back to the piece just a little tiny bit of character. Now, to finish up the baking cup, I had to glue my strips for my roofing on top, and then I glued little thin strips around the top and bottom to allow myself to cover up some nasty seams as well as give the piece a more finished look. All right, so for this next part, I ran out of super glue, which is exactly how that always goes. Actually, I should mention, I didn't run out of super glue. The top of the super glue thing, I get the Gorilla Glue that's, you know, the gel kind, and it gunks up in the top, so I can't ever get all of the super glue out. So I have like a quarter of the super glue in the bottom of the thing. I just can't get it to, you know, come out. Well, anyway, so I am off to go get super glue, but that will give me an opportunity to explain what I'm going to be doing in the next part. I'm going to be using paper towel to make like a little tarp overhang over the little wooden section. So what I'm going to do to support that is use little craft sticks to make like a substructure for it. That way it gives something to hang on, and it gives the tarp some like nice definition while it's hanging. So get more super glue, do that, let it dry. Now, after the paper towel dried, now between you and me, I am not going to do the dry time bit again. I'm sure it's getting old. I think it's funny, but that's not what's important here. It's probably not a great bit, even though I keep doing it over and over and over again. I'll probably do it next video, though. I had to replace the pins with a more decorative stake, something that made more sense along with the build. So what I did is I cut the tips off of toothpicks and then used those to drive down into the holes where the pins already made. And I could actually just use a little touch of glue on the end of those, and they absolutely sit just fine. With that done, the sculpt was basically finished, so now it was time to move on to paint. So I started by putting Black Magic Craft base coat over all of the foam. That is just a 50-50 mixture of black acrylic craft paint and matte Mod Podge. Now, I didn't put that over top of the sticks or the cloth, and there's a reason for that. With the cloth, I actually mixed up an original color, so I took matte Mod Podge and I mixed that with a beige to make a more appropriate undercolor for the cloth. And then I didn't put absolutely anything as far as this goes on the craft sticks, because what I'm going to do later is use paint to soak into that, which is going to end up being my final color for the wood. So for painting, I'm going to be doing my foam wood in my typical 3-color brown. Nothing exciting there. I'm going to be doing the canvas up top in the same boring 3-color paint scheme. Nothing exciting there. The things that are going to be interesting are going to be what I'm going to do for the rock and what I'm going to do for the actual wood. So for the rock, I'm going to do something a little different, and I'm actually going to take this English Ivy green, use that as my base coat. That should give the rock kind of a green, earthy feel to it, but then I'm just going to take it up with my regular pewter gray and then elephant gray as my highlight. When it was time to stain the craft sticks, I ended up actually doing a test here because I wanted to make sure that I picked the right color to make that new construction really stand out from the baking cup old construction. I just pulled out a piece of craft stick and I tried out 5 different colors, which were Wildwood Agaros Dunes, Agrax Earthshade, Seraphim Sepia, and Reichland Flesh Shade. Once I had the opportunity to look through all of them, the one that I decided was the most interesting was actually the Reichland Flesh Shade. It gave this really interesting redwood look, which I felt would stand out from a lot of my other woods that I've done on other buildings. I really am pleased with the way that this turned out. Painting up the stovepipe was easy. I just used Lead Belcher, which was a metallic paint from Citadel, and then I just did a dry brushing of black over the whole thing to give an idea of soot that constantly keeps coming out of this little chimney. Lastly, I decided to paint the door blue. This is an interesting choice, but it's one of those things where I wanted the door to be the focal point of the piece, and since I used a lot of oranges and reds and greens, but a warm green, I wanted something to be cooler on this piece. So a blue door is a really cool way to draw your eye right there and make it seem welcoming. But with that said, the whole piece was finished, and now it's time to move on to some glamour shots. So take this little build as an example of how inspiration can come from anywhere. This is such a unique little project that I can say for a fact I would not have built had it not been for me walking past my gaming table and seeing a little plastic baking cup and going, I can make something cool out of that. To me, this is what's so much fun about this hobby. You can take literally nothing and turn it into something if you just are creative enough and sit with it enough and think and create stories in your head for the pieces that you're making. So I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it. If you did, please leave me a like down below or a comment to say hi. Share this video with a friend that you think would enjoy it. That is the best way to help a small YouTube channel out. And also subscribe if you haven't yet. The channel's growing every day and it's so exciting to see all the new faces coming in. And I just always am blown away by that. So that's all I have for this week's video. Until next week, I'll be seeing you.